Welcome to today's deep dive.
No.
We have a really fascinating one for you today. Have you ever wondered how someone goes from bandaging catastrophic wounds in the middle of an active war zone to, standing in the literary spotlight as a Pulitzer Prize-nominated author?
It is a pretty incredible leap, yeah.
Right. It really is.
Oh.
So today we are unpacking the life and the literary footprint of American author Richard Curry. And our mission here is to examine how those two vastly different realities, like the visceral life and death chaos of a combat medic and the quiet, highly structured space of an acclaimed writer, how those ultimately intersect.
Exactly. And we're working off a single source today, which is a concise, factual Wikipedia biography of Curry. And I know on the surface, it reads like a standard chronological timeline, just dates and places.
Yeah, totally.
But if you look closely at the specific dates and the geographic shifts, and especially those thematic pivots in his bibliography, you start to see how an incredibly specific set of lived experiences formed the absolute backbone of his art.
Yeah, the timeline is essentially our map for this deep dive.
Yeah.
And we were starting in 1949. That is when he was born in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And given that West Virginia is really the geographic and cultural heart of Appalachia, you kind of have to wonder how that regional isolation influenced his worldview, right?
Yeah.
Long before he was ever thrust into a global war.
Oh, absolutely. Appalachia carries a very specific narrative weight. When we talk about Appalachian roots in literature, we are usually talking about a profound immersion in an oral storytelling tradition.
Right.
It's a region with a deep sense of family loyalty, intense connections to a rugged landscape, and a cadence of speech that is highly rhythmic, but, fundamentally unpretentious.
Unpretentious is a great word for it.
Yeah. Growing up in a post-war industrial river town like Parkersburg, that would give a future writer a very grounded ear for dialogue and a natural inclination towards stories about working-class resilience.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because his life does not stay isolated in those mountains. From 1968 to 1972, he serves as a Navy medical corpsman. And those years, those aren't just any random periods in history. We were talking about the absolute peak of the Vietnam War.
It's the very height of it, yeah.
And he wasn't drafted into a standard infantry role. Being a medical corpsman in that specific era carries a totally different psychological burden.
It is a profound shift in perspective. A combat medic or a corpsman occupies this very liminal space in a war zone. You are inherently part of the military apparatus, but your primary function is not to inflict damage. It is to mitigate it.
Wow, yes.
The psychological vantage point there is just staggering. You are running toward the casualties while everyone else is seeking cover. You are observing catastrophic physical trauma on a daily basis.
Which is it's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. And to survive that and to effectively do your job, you have to cultivate an intense clinical detachment. But simultaneously, you're holding the hands of terrified young people, which demands overwhelming empathy.
That tension right there between clinical detachment and raw empathy, that doesn't just vanish when you leave the service.
No, not at all.
You carry that duality with you. The necessity of, compartmentalizing horrors while still remaining human enough to treat the wounded. It seems like the exact psychological crucible that would forge a writer.
It forces you to become an observer of the human condition at its absolute extremes. You are seeing what people are made of when all the societal artifice is just stripped away by trauma.
Right. There's no pretense left.
None. And when a writer has that kind of visceral data to draw from, their prose rarely suffers from triviality. The stakes in their writing will always inherently reflect the life or death stakes they experience.
What's interesting about this military stint, though, is a glaring contradiction right in the middle of our source material.
Yes, the classification issue.
Right, because the main text of the Wikipedia article states clearly that he served as a Navy medical corpsman.
But if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, the user-generated categories list him as United States Army personnel of the Vietnam War.
Exactly. Navy in the heavily edited text, Army in the metadata at the bottom.
This raises an important question. And not just about Curry's specific service record, but about the architecture of the information we consume every day.
Definitely.
Wikipedia is an invaluable tool, but its structure relies on multiple layers of editing. The body text often requires citations and goes through rigorous peer review by editors focused on that specific author or subject.
Well, the text you actually read is heavily scrutinized.
But the categories at the bottom, however, are often added by casual editors or even automated bots trying to bulk classify pages based on keywords like Vietnam War and medic.
It really highlights how messy crowdsourced history can get. If someone just skimmed the tags to build a database of Army veterans, Curry gets misfiled entirely.
He does.
It's just a necessary reminder for you, as the listener, to always weigh the primary text against the metadata. Don't just take the tags at face value.
That's a great point. And moving forward on the timeline, Curry exits the military in 1972 and immediately pivots to academia. He spends 2 years, from 1972 to 1974, at West Virginia University. That is a massive state school, essentially a homecoming to his Appalachian roots after the chaos of the war.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because he doesn't stay there.
No, he doesn't.
In 1974, he transfers to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and he stays there until 1979.
Yeah.
Howard is arguably the most prominent historically black college or university in the country. Talk about cultural whiplash.
Oh, massive.
You are going from the rural mountains of West Virginia to the global trauma of a combat zone, back to a massive Appalachian state school, and then dropping into the epicenter of black academia in D.C. in the mid to late 1970s.
It's incredible.
That is a resume that just screams, I am trying to figure out America.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the 1970s in Washington, D.C. was an era of profound political and cultural reckoning. The country was processing the end of the Vietnam War and the fallout of Watergate.
Right, to a very volatile time.
Very. And Howard University was a vibrantly politically active hub of black intellectualism. For a white Appalachian Vietnam veteran to immerse himself in that specific academic and cultural environment for 5 years, it suggests a deep, restless intellectual curiosity.
He isn't just staying in his lane.
Exactly.
He is actively placing himself in environments where he is the outsider, where his baseline assumptions about the world are going to be challenged daily.
That kind of deliberate exposure is how a writer builds a multidimensional voice. He isn't relying on a single lens to view the world.
Yeah.
He has the insular specific culture of Appalachia, he has the rigid life and death hierarchy of the military, and he has the rich, culturally shifting landscape of a premier HBCU.
It's a completely unique triad of experiences.
It really is. When you combine those perspectives, you develop a profound capacity for nuance. You start to see the interconnectedness of different American struggles.
And that nuance clearly translated onto the page because the literary accolades listed in the source are incredibly significant.
They are major.
We're talking about a Pulitzer Prize nominee. He won an O. Henry Award,
Right.
which, is essentially the gold standard for short fiction in America.
Right.
It means your work has been recognized as fundamentally shaping the literary landscape of that year. And he was a PEN Hemingway Award finalist, which usually flags massive potential in early career fiction.
He also secured 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA.
Wow.
Those are incredibly competitive, peer-reviewed government grants. To get one is a career-defining moment. To get 2 signals sustained, undeniable artistic merit.
Yeah, they don't just hand those out twice by accident.
No. Add in the D.H. Lawrence Fellowship and a stint as a writer-in-residence at the University of New Mexico, and you have a clear picture of an author whose peers deeply respect his craft.
And when you look at his actual bibliography, the titles and publication dates map almost perfectly onto the life phases we just analyzed.
It's like a roadmap of his life.
It really is.
Yeah.
He starts by processing the war. In 1980, which is 8 years after his service ends, he publishes Crossing Over, a Vietnam journal. Then, in 1988, he follows it up with Fatal Light.
The 8-year gap between his service and that first book is very telling.
How so?
Well, it takes time to metabolize that kind of trauma before you can structure it into a narrative that civilian readers can actually digest.
That makes a lot of sense.
Crossing Over sounds like a literal documentation, a journal of that liminal space between life and death he occupied as a corpsman. By the time he writes Fatal Light almost a decade later, you can assume he is continuing to refine and explore the visceral flashbulb memories of combat from a more distant, perhaps more critical perspective.
But he doesn't stay in Vietnam, literally speaking. He pivots back to his roots. In 1990, he publishes The Wars of Heaven, and in 1997, Lost Highway.
Returning to the Appalachian landscape, it is a very common trajectory for writers who leave home, experience the wider, often chaotic world, and then realize that the foundational themes of their youth, things like isolation, community, survival, are just as potent as the themes of war.
He comes full circle.
He does. He takes the refined, globally tested literary voice he built and focuses it back on the mountains.
There's one entry in this bibliography that completely breaks the mold, though.
Oh, the nonfiction piece?
Yes. In 1992, right between those two Appalachian books, he publishes a nonfiction work titled Medicine for Sale, Commercialism versus Professionalism. And it is published by Whittle Communications, which is a company known for highly targeted media, often placing materials directly in doctors' waiting rooms.
What's fascinating here is he uses his highly specialized practical background in medicine to launch a systemic critique. Consider the cognitive dissonance at play here. His foundational experience with healthcare was combat triage, a pure, desperate form of medicine where resources are scarce, the environment is hostile, and the only metric of success is keeping a human being breathing for one more minute.
And then you return to the civilian world and you watch healthcare evolve into this massive corporate apparatus.
Exactly.
You were looking at profit margins, HMOs, and commercialized care.
The friction between those two realities would be immense. For a corpsman, medicine is a sacred, desperate duty. To see it treated as a commercial commodity would understandably provoke a sharp analytical response.
It really shows another side of his intellect.
It shows that Curry wasn't just interested in exploring his past through fiction. He was actively using his analytical skills to critique the present societal systems around him.
Which naturally leads to the core theme mentioned in the source material.
Yeah.
His role as a frequent speaker on the intersection of art and the military. We often treat those two worlds, the creative arts and the armed forces, as diametrically opposed. One is viewed as fluid and expressive, the other is rigid and tactical.
But that intersection is historically where some of our most vital literature comes from. The military experience, particularly in combat, isolates the service member from the civilian world.
It builds a wall.
A huge wall. The things you see, the decisions you have to make, create a gap in understanding that everyday language often fails to bridge. If you come home and just recite the facts of a battle, it doesn't convey the emotional truth of the experience.
Art serves as the translation matrix.
It gives shape to the unimaginable. A novel or a well-crafted memoir allows a civilian reader to safely step into the psychological space of the soldier.
Yeah.
By speaking extensively on this intersection, Curry advocates for the utility of art. It isn't just an aesthetic pursuit. It is a functional, necessary tool for veterans to process their history and for society to actually comprehend the immense psychological weight it asks its service members to carry.
So what does this all mean?
That is the big question.
We have traced the timeline from the mountains of West Virginia, through the triage tents of Vietnam, into the academic halls of Howard University, and finally into the upper echelons of American literature.
A hell of a journey.
It really is. For you listening to this right now, Richard Curry's biography is a masterclass in the utilization of lived experience.
Beautifully said.
It demonstrates that the disparate, confusing, and sometimes traumatic chapters of a life don't have to remain fragmented. You can forge them into something cohesive.
Yes.
He took the intense empathy required of a medic, the cultural education of an HBCU, and the storytelling rhythm of his Appalachian hometown, and he used them as raw material to build a legacy that bridges the gap between the military and civilian worlds.
And that legacy has a remarkable staying power. There is a detail in the publication history that leaves us with something quite profound to consider.
Oh yeah, the reprint dates.
Right. The Wikipedia info box lists his years active as 1974 to 1997, which covers the primary period when he was writing and publishing his major works.
But the bibliography notes show a huge resurgence much later.
They do.
Crossing over, his Vietnam journal from 1980 was reprinted by the Santa Fe Writers Project in 2018. That is 38 years after its initial publication.
That's practically unheard of.
Yeah. Zeta Light was reprinted in 2009. The Wars of Heaven was reprinted in 2014.
Decades after his officially active period, an entirely new publishing house looked at the literary landscape and decided these specific stories needed to be put back into print.
It wasn't just a digital archive.
No, it was an active reintroduction of his work to a new generation of readers.
If an independent publisher in 2018 looks at a book about the Vietnam War written in 1980 and says, "We need this on shelves today," it speaks volumes.
It forces us to ask, what does that tell us about the timeless nature of trauma and recovery? We might change the locations of our conflicts, and we might update the technology of medicine, but the core human experience of going to war, trying to heal the broken, and returning home to a society that doesn't quite understand, that remains entirely unchanged.
It's a universal truth.
The fact that Curry's work is still finding new audiences suggests that the conversation between art and the military is never actually resolved. It just finds new resonance with every generation that inherits the consequences of conflict.
The conversation doesn't end. We just keep needing new readers to engage with it.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration of Richard Curry's timeline has given you a new way to think about how diverse experiences shape the stories we tell. Until next time, keep seeking out the narratives that challenge your perspective.